Hi, thanks for sticking with me so far. I really tried to make this video short, but I just couldn't do it. So I figured if I periodically blew some stuff up, that might help keep your attention. The author Douglas Adams noted that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones you don't know you have. I realize now that in my first video, the most terrifying video you'll ever see, I made some assumptions that it turns out weren't shared by everybody. My bad. My intent was to try to get people thinking in terms of risk management instead of just debating scientific statements that they may or may not be in a good position to evaluate. It seems we have to talk about rows after all. As one commenter put it, you seem to have retreated from your initial claim that you have an argument that avoids the argument. Now you just have an argument. So here's my goal for the next couple minutes. I hope to convince you that it's in your interest to do everything you can to increase public demand for significant policy action on climate change. If I can't convince you of that, I have sort of a fallback plan, kind of a consolation prize. One of the big problems here is, if you're not a climatologist yourself, how are you supposed to sift through all the contradictory statements made by different experts? Robert Lindzen versus the rest of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the Oregon Petition versus the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity, the Leipzig Declaration. I mean, how are you supposed to decide what to believe and what not to believe? And one of the big dangers here that we all should be aware of is that it's just human nature to listen to the evidence that supports what we already believe and to discount the evidence that contradicts it. So I hope I can help you sort that out. As a science teacher, I'm sort of halfway between being a Joe Schmo and being a scientist. I have some understanding of the workings of both worlds, so maybe I can help translate some stuff for you. Some people have asked me about my specific qualifications, and I'd be willing to do another short video on that if enough people express interest. What? The shirt's not enough for you? The short answer is, it shouldn't matter what my qualifications are, because you shouldn't take what I say at face value anyway. That's what the Google is for. As we, the Joe Schmoes of the world, try to decide what to do with the different things that scientists are telling us, one of the problems we run into is this. We tend to think of science as being the most precise and certain of all human endeavors, so we expect it to give us the correct answer. But the surprising irony is, science is never certain. In fact, uncertainty is inherent in all science. I'd be happy to explore that further in yet another video, but the upshot is pretty much this. Science is based on measurements, and every time a scientist makes a measurement, they acknowledge that neither they nor their equipment is perfect, and so they make an estimate as to how large the error, or uncertainty, might be. And then they put the idea out there and invite criticism, so that the weak points can be identified and strengthened, and thus the uncertainty reduced. That's why it's so important to ask whether the statement you're hearing about climate change has been peer-reviewed or not. That's the official process that science uses to try to get closer and closer and closer to the truth about the physical world. But it never claims to actually get there. So where does that leave us if every statement from science is accompanied by an implicit, I could be wrong? How do we decide what to go on? Here are two rules of thumb. The first is, if you have the inclination, you can take a look at what the scientists are saying to each other. I regularly read some scientific and lay scientific literature, and I'll tell you, for a number of years now, the general tenor about climate change has been not at all controversial. Generally, when it's mentioned, the article assumes that the reader is on board with the idea that humans are changing the climate. The big debate is on how fast it's happening and exactly what it's going to look like. That should tell you something. The second rule of thumb, and the easier of the two, is to see what statements float to the top of that whole bruising process of peer review and scientific debate. You do that by looking at what the professional associations are saying, because generally only the most robust, well-tested, agreed-upon ideas will be adopted by those organizations of scientists. So their pronouncements are about as close as we can get to a gold standard of statements about what science knows. Unfortunately, that process usually takes some time to play itself out. Fortunately, on the subject of human-caused climate change, that process has largely already happened. In fact, in just the last couple of years, two of the world's most respected scientific bodies, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, NAS, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, have both come out with strongly worded statements saying essentially the same thing. 1, the climate is changing. 2, humans are primarily the ones driving it. 3, it's going to be bad. And 4, we should do something about it quick. I shared this in a previous video, but it's worth repeating here. The AAAS statement said, "The scientific evidence is clear. Global climate change caused by human activities is occurring now, and it is a growing threat to society." It also pointed out that the longer we wait to tackle climate change, the harder and more expensive the task will be. You catch that? More expensive. The NAS statement said, "The scientific understanding of climate change is now sufficiently clear to justify nations taking prompt action," and calls on world leaders to acknowledge that the threat of climate change is clear and increasing. This isn't a bunch of hippies. This is as close as you get to the science establishment, capital letters. These are the nerdiest people on the planet. Why are we still talking about this? You don't get more authoritative in matters of science than AAAS and the National Academy. I gotta tell you folks, if that's not good enough for you, then nothing from science ever will be. Sometimes you hear there's no scientific consensus amongst scientists on global warming. Well, newsflash, there's no scientific consensus about anything. You will always have scientists that disagree, and you know why? Because science is uncertain. Pick the most well-known, well-established scientific law you can think of. Law of gravity, right? Guess what? There's no consensus on it. We got a satellite up there right now called Gravity Probe B, testing to see if we can disprove our current understanding of gravity. If you're waiting for there to be no dissent at all, you'll wait forever, no matter what the scientific issue. Science is never certain. So why listen to it at all? Because it's the best we've got. And the best science we've got, articulated by the most well-respected organizations on the planet, is that the globe is warming, we're the ones doing it, it's going to be bad, and we better do something about it quick. If you'd like to argue any of these points, feel free. But you better come loaded for bear, because you'll be going up against two of the premier scientific organizations in the world. You'll want to bring along some extraordinary evidence, and not just a couple of ideas that sound good, like Mars is warming too, or CO2 lags behind temperature in the ice core record. Both true statements, both irrelevant. Do you think these guys don't know what they're doing? You can think what you like about what the future might hold, but you can't deny that we are essentially running an experiment right now about what kinds of effects we can or cannot have on the global climate. The kicker is, whatever the outcome of the experiment, you're in the test tube. That's why it's in your interest to do whatever you can to increase public demand for policies that take significant and immediate action on climate change. Make no mistake, anything less, and you would be explicitly denying the best that science has to offer. I see you remain unconvinced. You're a tough nut to crack, but how about this? Imagine you're back in World War II, and the new possibility of an atomic weapon was public knowledge instead of top secret. Would you have insisted on understanding the finer points of atomic physics yourself before agreeing to the funding for the Manhattan Project? Would you have been against action until every single scientist interviewed by the media said such a weapon was a possibility? No. You would have agreed that just the potential that Germany possessed a superweapon was a great enough threat to justify putting our best and brightest on the job, to have them work with the greatest urgency towards an end that no one was certain they could even achieve. Well, if the possible threat of an atomic weapon in the hands of Germany, just the possibility, was enough to justify the Manhattan Project, don't the statements from AAAS and the National Academy, our most authoritative scientific bodies, give us enough already to justify a similar project for climate change? To get our best and our brightest and have them do this grid, numbers and all, right away. Let's not kid ourselves anymore. You can ask about solar activity or natural cycles or proxy data, but the climate is just way too complex for you or me to do armchair evaluation of this stuff anymore in the face of so much peer-reviewed science. Let's get the big boys and girls on it. Don't we deserve that? And I'm not talking about forming another commission to study the problem further. We've been doing that for 20 years, and the statements I shared earlier make it clear that that time is past. I'm talking a project on the scale of the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project put together. We could even call it the Manpollo Project if you want. One with the greatest national urgency and resources, drafting the best scientists, political economists, historians, and analysts on the planet to bring their greatest effort to bear, to work round the clock on what our leading science organizations have said may be the greatest challenge we've ever faced. In fact, there's a silver bullet. Both sides of the debate will agree that we should have a Manpollo project, and here's why. Because each side thinks the project will get us closer to the truth and dispel the untruths that the other side has spun. So we all want this, because everyone thinks they're right and would love further ammunition to prove the other side wrong. Wouldn't that be worth the cost? Because a Manhattan Project is not going to cause a global depression. An Apollo project is not going to bankrupt the US or lead to government control of your life. So really, what's to lose? If we have a Manpollo project and it finds that human-caused climate change turned out to be bunk, then hey, okay, we diverted some government jobs from one sector to another. Isn't reducing the uncertainty about all this worth at least that cost? Let's get to it. If you find an error in my logic or my assumptions, please tell me where, politely. And if you can't, well, for Pete's sake, don't just sit there. Spread the word. Talk to your friends. Forward this video to others. Get clicking. Let's make this the chain letter that maybe ended up saving our collective neck. Sorry. I just get kind of worked up about this. Anyway, that's my understanding of things. But I could be wrong. How about you?